Hello, everyone. Welcome to the next part of Dr. Dave Regis's openings repertoire. That's the book, a free ebook by the good doctor that you can find at the website of the Exeter Chess Club, I believe. And he's been kind enough to say I'm allowed to turn it into videos for you guys to watch. Show lots of small parts. And we've finished looking at Dr. Dave's suggestions for white, which is basically a repertoire based on e4. And the last opening we looked at was what to do against the French defence. And it's almost as though we plan these things, because Dr. Dave's suggestion for playing with the black pieces against e4 is actually the French defence. Let's have a look at a few of the basics before we run through some games. And the French defence goes a little bit like this: d4, d5. You can play some other things as white, but knight f3, knight f3, still d5, nothing to stop you. Knight c3, still d5, nothing to stop you. The main line is to play d4 and then d5, fine. And then there's lots of different things that white can do. White can play exactly what Dr. Dave recommends against the French. So the Monte Carlo, which is quite an imbalanced game, and you'll probably end up with the isolated queen's pawn position in the middle of the board, which is fine. In the normal exchange variation, white can just do the whole sort of normal safe developing kind of thing, and both sides will castle, and yeah, it's okay. It's pretty level, maybe the tiniest advantage for white just because they happen to move first, but okay, fine. Nothing wrong with it, perfectly safe, but very plain because the pawn structures are so completely identical. Both sides are symmetrical was the word I was trying to spit out, symmetrical. So that's a possibility. You'll also see the advanced variation, which is here. So e5, the very natural, just slipping past this pawn and creating a wedge in the middle of the board. And what will happen then is is c5. Important for black not to play the knight in front of the pawn in the French. This is a really important move for black in the French defense most of the time c5. So c5, c3, and you'll have a little fight going on for the d4 square in the middle of the board. Black will bring some other pieces to attack d4. So knight will go here, queen will go here. Everything will line up on this square. And white will play moves like knight to f3, possibly the knight to e2, and then this knight here and this knight to f3, this kind of thing to defend this square. Maybe you'll get bishop here defending as well. Okay, so that's the advanced variation. And what's interesting about it is in a lot of the variations of the French defense, you kind of get this almost sort of trench warfare line of pawns across the middle of the board, and white will operate on the king side, so kind of over this side of the board that I've illustrated. Black might operate on the queen side, kind of this side of the board that I've just illustrated, and the sort of the two sides have a half each. But white does have a slight space advantage because of this advanced e5 pawn. So, okay, and another move black will do in this at some occasions is the move f6, again to hit at this pawn chain. So it's all about breaking this pawn chain for black. You have to be a little careful moving the f pawn in case there's any nasty checks up here. So that's the advanced variation. What else can happen? White can play knight to c3, and I believe there's possibilities here for black. It's the Rubinstein variation, which is what I play on the rare occasions I do play the French. I play this one, and it's very, very solid, very safe. Computer will slightly favor white because this center pawn is a bit more advanced than black's center pawn, so white has a bit more space, but it's pretty solid for black. You're probably going to have to think about how to develop this bishop, maybe this way, or maybe you might be able to get in b6 and bishop b7. You're probably going to want to play c5 at some point, but it's okay. It's just a slight advantage to white because of more space, but pretty solid, the Rubinstein variation. I think knight f6, and there is the classical variation, and then you're probably going to get e5, knight here. Okay, this is all fine. Just do not forget that you've got to play this pawn to c5 before you develop the b8 knight to c6. Do not block this pawn in these variations. So this is fine. And another possibility for black here would be the Vinower variation. So pinning the knight to the king. This one's pretty sharp, pretty complicated sometimes. Just this isn't necessarily the best book moves, but to give you an idea of how it will look, is you'll usually get this kind of possible pawn formation. So white with a really nice strong wedge in the center of the board, but slightly dodgy if you get to an endgame. Very bad pawn formation in an endgame potentially because they're isolated and doubled. And black will do the usual thing, hitting against it, possibly f6, although that's a bit risky in the Vinova variation. White queen's going to come this way, attack this pawn. Black queen's going to come this way, try to look at this pawn. Pretty sharp stuff, the Vinova variation. I think that's most of it in that situation. Sometimes white will play knight d2 just to avoid getting pinned. Now there's no point in playing bishop d4 because white can just go c3 and kick it. So in this situation, you've still got the possibility of the Rubinstein because it's just the same position anyway. So that's okay. You can, I think, play knight to f6, and you're probably going to get exactly the same thing where you play c5 and then knight here. And I believe black can play the Tarrasch system here. Oops, sorry, I need to put the knight back first. The open Tarrasch system here, this kind of system here where you might end up potentially with an isolated queen's pawn. If you've been watching the other videos, you'll recognize that Dr. Dave is not scared of having this isolated queen's pawn. New viewers, what's an isolated queen's pawn? Well, it's the pawn in front of the queen, there it is, and it's got no friendly pawns on the lines next to it, so it's isolated. Now, if you take all the pieces off and just have this in an endgame, because it can't be defended by pawns, it's probably going to be a weakness. But in this stage, the middle game, it's nice, it's in the center of the board, it's a basis for operations. You can get the rooks operating the lines around it. You've got these nice squares here. If you can advance the thing, you might well be in a very good position. Whereas white's going to play moves to try and block it from moving forwards. I'm just sort of making things up as I go a little bit here because I say I'm not a French defense player. But white will try to swap pieces off and prove this is a weakness in an endgame. So it's like complicated stuff. Okay. Of course, black doesn't have to end up with the isolated queens. Well, they do actually. If white swaps, they would do. But okay. I think that's pretty much covered most of what is sensible. So on that note, let's just get on with Dr. Dave's example games. And I'm doing this in a slightly different order today to how Dr. Dave set it out in the book, because these 4 games are the shortest of the ones given with the French defense. And I figured that having done a little intro, the last thing we wanted was then for me to pick the longest game straight away because it would make the video a bit long. So we've got 4 games. So we're going to start with just a couple of traps. So very, very simple opening traps, just things that your opponents might fall for if they don't quite know what they're doing, especially at beginner level. So this is all normal. Now this move attacks the e4 pawn, obviously. And one of the weird things that white might do to defend it is f3. This is actually a horrid blunder. Well, horrid blunder is a bit excessive, but it's not a good move. And it's not a good move because after pawn takes pawn, if white recaptures, which they're likely to do at junior level, they run into this check. And you have to get out of check, and then you lose the pawn. And if you get out of check by blocking it, you've not only lost the pawn, but you've actually lost the rook as well to a fork. So that might arise in your games, possibly, when you're playing sort of against other newer players. Pretty unlikely to see that at master level, I think it's fair to say. But okay, just so you're aware of the trick. So if f3, your best bet is to swap the pawns, and yeah, watch for this trick. Okay, the other sort of trick that Dr. Dave gives, let's just turn the board upside down because we're learning from the black point of view here now, is this one here. Oh, excuse me, sorry, bishop to c4. Now this isn't a very good move. It's going to allow black to attack the bishop with gain of time. So we're going to attack the bishop and develop our own position. And the computer's already saying that white's gone from plus 0.4 to minus 0.6. So it's a clear mistake. It's a clear strategic mistake. So d5, attacking the bishop, and there's plenty of pieces defending the pawn. Pawn takes, pawn takes. Now, a junior level, beginner level, you're likely to see, oh, check. No, not check, bad arrow. Check. So let's give check. And then we block it. c6, and the bishop ought to run away. But it might go here. And now we've got a level-ish position, slight advantage to black. Computer actually says it's quite pleasant for black. This minus 1.4 is a good position for black. And they probably should just develop pieces and get castled and have a really, really comfortable game. But in Dr. Dave's example, white plays the move a5, which is okay, but it's not really developing anything. There's no need for it. But what it does do is set a trap. And be aware of this, knight f3, and now b5. Attacking the bishop, and the pawn's defended. So where exactly is this bishop going to go to avoid being lost for a pawn? Well, if it slides back here, a4 attacks the bishop again. This pawn's defended. This square is defended. And obviously this pawn's defended. So white has just lost a pawn in the Noah's Ark trap, as it's known. So yeah, two very, very cheap traps. Okay, we'll finish this first video. I think there's going to be 5 videos, by the way, for seeing the French defence as black. As Dr. Dave gives 20 games, so it makes sense to do 5 lots of 4. So our first proper game between named players is Murgia against Champi from Ischia in 1994. I don't know these players, so I don't know if they're masters or just local club players, but let's see how it went. So e4, e6, d4 and d5, and we have an advanced variation. So, okay, we're going to have this kind of fun and games in the middle of the board, fighting over the d4 square. c3 from white, knight to c6, yet another piece attacking d4, knight to f3, yet another piece defending it. You see where this is going, same pattern. Bishop d7, a3. This is, I think, because just to throw a variation on the board, pawn takes, this pawn being here now stops any ideas of annoying checks with the bishop down here, because of course pawn takes bishop. So I think that's the logic behind a3. And black plays an odd move. I don't think this is awful, but it just feels very odd to fix all of these pawns on white squares when your bishop is trapped behind them. I know you could kind of say the same about the white bishop being trapped behind pawns on dark squares, but it feels, doesn't it, like the white bishop's got rather more space than this black bishop here. But anyway, okay, it's not a disaster. Computer says it's still level, so I mean, yeah, I can't knock it. So c4, g3 played. And now this move f6, remember I said this, you've got to do something to break up this pawn chain. And especially now this possibility is gone, right? We've moved this pawn forward, so we can't do that. We're going to try to break up the pawn chain. So it's an interesting idea. White plays knight to h4, which threatens the possibility, do you remember I said, of the queen coming down here? And black then invites a trap and plays queen to b6, actually allows the check. White goes for the check, and black doesn't play pawn here because that would be a mistake. Knight takes, pawn takes, and queen takes rook, and white's winning because a rook is worth considerably, or rook and a pawn is certainly worth more than a knight. But instead, king to d8. And this looks like white couldn't actually win the rook, because knight here, we're attacking the rook. There's obviously no way to escape. And if you play pawn takes knight, well, queen takes rook means you've won rook for knight, and that's good news, you'd think. But there's a bit more to it than meets the eye. And black, actually, as you can tell from the analysis bar, the eval bar here, is actually winning in this position because they can win a piece for pretty much zero compensation. So if you want to have a little go at finding the correct move for black in this position, please feel free to do so. Otherwise, I'll carry on in 3, 2, and 1. And if you found the right move, which is this move, bishop to e8, well done. It completely pins the knight. For example, if knight takes rook, bishop takes queen, and you've lost 9 points, the queen, for 5, the rook. And if you don't do that, what else are you going to do? I mean, knight takes bishop, same thing, but in fact, it's even worse because the bishop's worth less than the rook. And if you just move the queen out of the way, well, a move like that, black just plays bishop takes knight, and they've just won a straight piece and has an extra knight on the board. And at a higher level of chess, once you're a piece up with no compensation, that's pretty much the end of that. So yeah, after bishop to e8 in the game, excuse me, sorry, wrong move. After bishop e8 in the actual game played in the tournament, white resigned. So a win for black in the French defense on move 11. Okay. One more game in this short video. As I say, we're going to break it into 5 videos so that it's a bit more bite-sized. Let's flip the board so we're seeing things from the black point of view. So e4 and e6. And by the way, I just say in the next 4 or 5 videos, we're looking at e4 and then the French. After that, we'll look at what Dr. Dave suggests against moves like d4, knight f3, and various other things. But for now, we're sticking to this. And d4 from white, d5 from black. And we have another advanced variation, e5, c5, c3, knight to c6, knight to f3. Same old thing that you'll get in the advanced French. How is the battle for this square going to resolve itself? Bishop to d7 from black, just developing. Bishop to d3 from white, just developing. Rook to c8 from black, because if you swap pawn and pawn, that gives this rook a really nice line potentially to get into the game, as you're going to see, I suspect. And then queen e2 from white, which looks like a sensible developing move, but actually it's a real problem. You can tell because the bar has now decided there's a slight advantage to black here. And actually, this pretty much, I think, means black's won a pawn. What? Why? Well, pawn takes pawn. Knight takes. Knight takes. Pawn takes. And suddenly this queen is no longer on d1. This bishop is undefended. And remember, I said the rook could be dangerous on the open file. Well, not only is that check, but the only 2 ways to escape, one is to put the queen in the way, and obviously that's no good. And the other is to move the king, and that isn't very attractive either. Ouch. And just to point out, if white plays pawn takes pawn, they're not really doing anything because knight here uncovers an attack from the rook to this undefended bishop. And although white is 1 piece better off than they were in the previous variation, they still have to lose their queen. And yeah, at a certain level of chess, once you're a queen down, that is it. And in fact, the computer's saying -10, which is that's a big old advantage for the player of the black pieces. Okay, so that will do for just sort of an introduction video to playing the French defense as black. I think 4 more parts. I think four games in each part is plenty. So hopefully that was interesting. And I'll see you soon for some slightly longer, slightly more detailed miniature games in the French defense. Thanks for watching.